This podcast is sponsored by nobody. Hey dudes, welcome to Splat from the Past, the only 80s themed horror and sci-fi show where things can get totally radical. Now today I will be welcoming Debbie Kruger. Debbie wrote a book called Songwriters Speak, where she interviews all these great Australian musicians. It's a really great book. It came out in 2005, and it's been reissued. You know, it's a real definitive guide to music that came from Australia of all kinds. And she interviews everybody from the Easy Beats to guys from Midnight Oil, Andrew Ferris from INXS, Colin Hay from Men at Work. Oh my God, so many great people. Iva Davies from Ice House, you know, the Finn brothers from Split Ends, lots of great people, and we're going to talk about that today. I had heard her on Stacey Lane Wilson's podcast this summer, and I liked her energy. I liked her Australian accent. I was like, oh, I'll reach out to her. You know, she's got a history with music. You know, she's written for publications like Variety and so forth. She's been a publicist and all of that. And it's going to be a great conversation today. And it's the day after 9/11, and I can't stress enough how, you know, yesterday was 22 years since 9/11 happened. And I have to give another 10 seconds of silence to the 9/11 victims and their families. Rest in peace, the 9/11 victims, and my condolences to their families. So yeah, here is my interview with Debbie Kruger.
Hello.
Hey Debbie, welcome to the show. How are you today?
Hey, Tommy, I'm good. How are you?
I am just fantastic. This is such a great honor. Thank you so much for taking the time today.
Oh, of course, and thank you so much for your interest. I really appreciate that. My book that began all the way down in Australia and now is international.
That is just so wonderful. Yeah, I heard you on Stacey's podcast, and I liked your energy, and I liked your accent, so I was like, I'll reach out to her.
That Aussie accent, yeah, I've got the shrimp on the barbie and all of that. Actually, I don't.
Going back in time, I was reading that you had a religious upbringing and music was always a big part of your life from the get-go, and you even performed in school musicals. Did you want to be an actress or a singer before journalism?
Well, you know, religious upbringing, I guess that's a whole other conversation. It wasn't. It was religiously oriented as a child, but it wasn't super religious. But no, I think I recognized really early on that I had no talent in that area, but I was like the little engine that almost could. Yeah. It was actually, Rachel Ehrlich was this girl I was at primary, like elementary school with, and she always got the lead roles. And I always got relegated to some minor role. But when I finally did do some acting in my university years, I had such acute stage fright. Yeah. I just knew that I was better off behind the scenes. But, you know, like any kid, you know, pretending to sing into a microphone in a mirror. Yeah. Lip syncing to favorite pop songs.
We all did.
We all did. And can I tell you a little story about that, which I love, actually? The first time I met Anne and Nancy Wilson from Heart, in 1998, I told them that I used to run home from high school almost every day and get dressed up and look in the mirror and lip sync to the entire Dreamboat Annie album. Wow. Every day. That was my thing. And Nancy just looked at me totally seriously. She said, well, we did that to Beatles records. That's what we did. Mm-hmm. And I love that she validated what I was telling her and that it is a thing. That we all do. It's just that I wasn't talented like Anne and Nancy. I like to say I play a mean tambourine.
Yeah, that's awesome. So what made you gravitate towards journalism? Were you always the kid that, like, asked questions?
You I probably was. I probably drove everyone mad with my questions, and I still do. I was a writer. That's what I was. From the moment I could hold a pencil or a pen, I was writing stories, and I still am. And I kind of, I went through high school in those years where career counsellors were a new thing, and one looked at me and said, oh, well, I guess there's nothing you can do except an arts degree. And I thought that was really kind of rude and limiting. And in those days in Australia, there were a few communications journalism degrees. So I applied for one and I got in. But then I decided that's not what I want to do right now. I don't want to train to be a journalist. So I did end up doing a general arts degree and excelling at English literature and drama, and then a master's in theatre. But I ended up going into journalism, but it was entertainment journalism, and I was reviewing plays and concerts, and so it was the ideal gig for a fan type person like me to legitimize all the theatre going and concert going I wanted to do.
Wonderful. Do you remember your first concert?
Bay City Rollers, December the 6th, 1975. Opening act, Andy Gibb.
Oh, wow.
Now, we're talking 75. That was long before the brothers brought him over to America. And I will never forget it. And the ticket was $6 Australian plus a 60-cent booking fee. Mm-hmm. That was the days when you'd line up at the ticket office, to buy your ticket, and they'd show you the paper map. So, but my second concert is even more impressive. My second concert in April 1976 was Queen, doing a night at the Opera.
Oh, love it. It's one of my favorites.
Yeah.
Your first album was David Bowie's Pin-Ups?
My first album by an artist as opposed to a K-Tel compilation. Yes. It was Bowie Pin-Ups. I really liked his cover of Sorrow, which was a big hit in the radio.
Yeah.
And that was the album I bought. I think the second was Casey and the Sunshine Band, and my third was Janis Ian's Between the Lines, or thereabouts. Those I remember as my first three albums by an artist as opposed to a compilation like Superbad and Rock Explosion and Explosive Hits, Ripper. Yeah, that's what we had in Australia. I'm guessing in America you had similar.
Yeah, I love Bowie's cover of The Kinks' Where Have All the Good Times Gone. I think it's far superior to Van Halen's version.
Well, and interestingly, with that album, it does tie in an interesting way to the topic we are discussing today of my book, Songwriters Speak, because probably the most important songwriters in my book, certainly from an Australian perspective, were Harry Vanda and George Young, who wrote Friday on My Mind for their band, the Easy Beats. And 20-something years ago, when I was head of communications for APRA, which is the Australasian Performing Right Association, the Australian-New Zealand equivalent of ASCAP, BMI, those performing right organisations, we put together a 75th anniversary big gala night for APRA and announced the 10 best Australian songs of those 75 years as voted by a select committee of industry people. And there was never any doubt that Friday on My Mind would be voted the number one song. And so when I got Bowie Pin-Ups and I heard his version of Friday on My Mind, I was too young to have been into the Easy Beats, and therefore I learnt the song through David Bowie.
Nice.
Isn't that interesting? And often, particularly in the 70s, we did learn songs through covers. Linda Ronstadt covered so many 50s songs that I learned through her, and 60s songs. But I do think that's an interesting point, that my first album was Bowie Pin-Ups, that he was covering songs by artists that he admired, and that Friday on My Mind was one of them. And then I ended up, interviewing Vanda and Young, working with Harry Vanda when I was at APRA, and we were doing that whole 10 Best Australian Songs thing. I love that about life, and particularly about music, how there are these lines, these song lines, these storylines that weave and bring things together that might otherwise never be connected, you know?
Right. Now, fast forward, to 2004, 2005, and, you've been writing publications and you've worked in PR. What sparked your interest in writing songwriter speak?
I read in the late 90s. I came to LA. I used to come quite regularly, and I had quite a watershed visit in 1997. And one of the things that happened was I bought a collection of books, and one of them was Paul Zollo's books, Songwriters on Songwriting. And I had already been very interested in songwriters. I was the kid, like a lot of us were, that read every line and wondered who were these people. And I devoured that book, and I read it from the first chapter through to the last. I read it in the sequence that he had presented in his book. And when I met Paul the following year, he said to me, nobody ever reads my book in the order that I presented. And I said, well, I did. I wanted to go on the journey that you were offering. So I already had the idea that the art of the interview was a thing. And then I got my job at APRA in the year 2000. And while I was working with Australia and New Zealand's leading songwriters, I kept thinking, this should be done here. Nobody else has done it. A lot of these songwriters are globally famous. In Excess, Little River Band, Men at Work, Midnight Oil, etc., and people like Vanda and Young and John Farrar and Steve Kipner. So I started talking to some of the songwriters. If I were to work on such a book, would you be in it? And universally it was sure. So I started the whole enterprise while I was still working at APRA. And then I left APRA and just concentrated on it full time.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a part of music history that doesn't get talked about a lot. It seems like the British get more accolades for the history of non-American rock and roll than Australia or Ireland or Scotland or Germany. Why do you think that is?
Well, I can't speak to Scotland or Germany. I'm not sure about Germany. I think that's a bit niche. But Australia, I don't know. I mean, I actually do think that going right back to the Seekers, and Bruce Woodley is in my book, and he wrote with Paul Simon, right, that Australian songwriters were taken seriously until Little River Band, however, and then In Excess. They all tended to go to London, to the United Kingdom. A lot of them had come as immigrants from England and Europe to Australia, and it felt logical to them to go home. And I mean, in a way, that's what the Bee Gees did too, because they went back to the UK before they then moved over to America. But that's certainly what the Easy Beats did, and bands and songwriters that had come, that had led to Little River Band, the Twilights and Axiom and Zoot. These are bands, pop groups, whose members went on to form Little River Band, and they all went to the UK thinking that if they could break through in London, and I suppose it was a Beatles and Kinks sort of thing that drove them. But once Little River Band broke through in America, and then Men at Work and In Excess and others after them, it really did shine a light on what had always been there, which was that there was a prodigious, artistry in music and songwriting down here, given the small population. Mm-hmm. Olivia Newton-John and Helen Reddy, were already big stars in America, and Helen was writing. Olivia, not so much, but John Farrar, her writer and producer, had come from Australia. So So, Rick Springfield is Australian, and
Oh, yeah.
he'd moved over, and he'd moved to LA in the 70s. He's one that I wish I'd had in my book, because there's a bunch that, I couldn't get to for one reason or another at the time. Scotland, not that au fait with Scottish. I mean, I guess
The Bay City
the
Rollers are
Eurythmics.
Scottish.
Yeah, but they were not writing their songs particularly.
Right.
And I wouldn't call any songs they might have written to be earth-shattering, but, maybe Annie Lennox. And, look, that's a whole other, culture and where it comes from, how we discover the songs that we love in spite of where they're from. I think a country like Germany, like all European countries, like France, there's always going to be the limitation that they're not English-speaking and English-writing countries, and therefore their audience is going to be more limited.
Right.
So it's very rare that, I remember when I was in 12th grade, Splat pour moi by Plastique Bertrand broke through as a pop song. He was actually French-Belgian. But, yeah, even Charles Aznavour had to sing in English before he really broke through. Right.
Now, why that title? Because I can tell you from a consumer standpoint, when I hear a title like Songwriters Speak, it's not super specific other than, it's about songwriters, but you didn't want to, make some clever reference to Australia in the title?
No, because I didn't want it to be considered more niche than it already was in 2005 when it came out. No, it was Songwriters Speak, Conversations About Creating Music. No, at the time I was doing it, there were a lot of international songwriters in the mix, and I travelled overseas from Australia to do a bunch of the interviews. Mm-hmm. So, no, I mean, there was no social media then.
Right.
And spreading the word internationally was more through direct marketing to online fan clubs. But I tell you what, when I was packaging books and signing them and sending them off, I had a lot of Savage Garden fans, Midnight Oil fans, and Nick Cave fans buying this book.
Yeah.
There are people everywhere, and In Excess fans to an extent. It's nicer now that it's being republished. It's been republished in the last few months because of social media and being able to get the word out there. And Amazon, listed on Amazon, and off you go.
I think you're kind of lucky you didn't get Rick Springfield, though. I heard he's complicated.
Oh, but that's the joy. I mean, this is a man who's openly manic depressive, who's, who has all kinds of addictions that he's written about in depth in his memoir. And to talk to him about his songwriting, I think would have been fascinating. When I spoke to Tim Finn, who founded Splat, he talked a lot about depression and how to create in that place of sadness. Nick Cave, talked about that as well. Mm-hmm. There are some that just can't write when they're depressed and sad, and there are others that feed off it. Right. That's what drives them. So no, actually, I tried to interview Rick some years later for something else, but his book had just come out, and I think he was just tired of talking about himself at the time. Yeah. But one day I'd like to interview him, but my mecca of interviews, the one I want more than anything, is Barry Gibb, because I tried to get him for the book. His brother Morris had just died quite suddenly, if you remember, and his personal manager just was protecting him and wouldn't let me near him, unfortunately.
That's sad,
But if I ever had the chance to sit at Barry's feet, he'd never escape
Yeah.
because because there's been books on the Bee Gees and there's been that amazing documentary, but which actually has some lovely insight into how they wrote, but there still has never really been the depth of questioning about certain songs. Mm-hmm. And that's something I would love to do.
How long did it take to write the book, and how long were you usually granted to spend time with the people you interviewed?
Well, I never spent less than an hour with anyone, and the most I got would have been 6 hours. And some were done over a couple of sittings, like Tim Fenn. In fact, one was in Sydney and the second half was in Auckland. The average was probably 3 hours. I was told with Nick Cave, who I travelled all the way to England to interview, that I would only get an hour, and he gave me 3 hours, and he was very happy too because he loved Paul Zollo's book, Songwriters on Songwriting, and very much wanted to be a part of mine. There was really only one who was kind of uncomfortable in the interview process and a bit difficult, but he was just notoriously like that in those days. I've never really encountered him since, so I don't know if he's the same. But most of them loved it. They appreciated being asked the kinds of questions that I did, and some who were pretty hardcore, difficult people, by reputation, mm-hmm. said to me at the end, "Wow, you ask good questions, and thank you for asking intelligent questions." And and that was really gratifying to me. And then I spent a lot of time transcribing, because I did all the transcribing myself, editing, cleaning up, checking a few things. Like somebody would say something and I'd go, I'm not sure that's actually accurate. And then I would email and go, listen, you said this. Is that really what you meant? Mm-hmm. And I had one songwriter who thanked me profusely for checking with him, because he was quite hungover the morning I interviewed him. There were 45 songwriters interviewed and 40 chapters, because a few of the chapters contained 2 songwriters. My first interview took place, a couple of them were done while I was at APRA for the APRA Members Journal, and that was 2001. But the first interviews that I did specifically for the book were in 2002 here in Los Angeles, where I currently am speaking to you from. And my final interview with the late, wonderful Archie Roach, an Australian Indigenous songwriter, was... I interviewed him in late 2004. So, or maybe not late, but maybe October 2004, I think it was. So it was more than 2 years of full-on interviewing, transcribing, editing. And then I would write an introduction to each chapter, and some of those came very easily to me, and some of those I laboured over. But I wanted to set the scene for the interview, and I also wanted to give some historical context. So, it's a 600-page book. It took a while.
Peter Allen was dead, but would you have interviewed him?
Oh, God, yes. Peter Allen, a guy called Mark Hunter, who was the lead singer and co-songwriter from a group called Dragon, who his brother Todd Hunter is in my book with his wife Joanna Piggott. They together have written a lot of amazing songs. A guy called Ted Mulry, who was from the same era and same music, like publishing house, as Harry Vander and George Young. He died in 2001. And Michael Hutchins, the chapter on NXS would obviously have been much more colourful and detailed if I'd had Michael as well as Andrew. And at the time I interviewed Andrew Farriss in 2001, it really was only a few years after Michael had died. So he was still quite shell-shocked and a little confounded.
Yeah, I could tell that he seemed like he felt a little empty by the fact that Michael had passed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so many years have gone by since that interview, and they had different lead singers and went back out on the road. But I'm not sure that Andrew ever wrote anything again he was always working in a studio and producing and doing what he does, but I'm not sure that he ever wrote anything again that would be comparable with the work he did with Michael. I mean, that was one of those magical combinations, along with Rob Hurst and Jim Magini from Midnight Oil, and Vanda and Young, and Darren Hayes and Daniel Johns from Savage Garden. These songwriting partners that come together and just like a Bernie Taupin and Elton John, or a Lennon McCartney, or
Keith Richards and Mick Jagger.
Yes, exactly. They don't even necessarily like each other, but they write beautifully together. As it happens, Andrew and Michael did like each other. They loved each other. And so, the interview with Andrew, even though it was 3 or 4 years after Michael had died, was just imbued with so much grief and bewilderment. And that's why I write in the new preface to the book that, nothing's been edited or changed or updated. These are interviews that stand as a testament to the time they were conducted. And you can look at an interview like the Andrew Farriss one and go, well, so much has changed since then, but how insightful to read, the things that he was saying at that time. Mm-hmm. A lot of these songwriters have gone on to do more and have been interviewed extensively since. But there's never been another book on songwriters come out in Australia and New Zealand. This one is still the one and only of its kind.
Yeah, I also like that Andrew Farriss chapter, because I found out some stuff I didn't know. Like, I didn't know that he wasn't crazy about Don't Change, but he liked it. And yeah, I mean, that's like one of the quintessential NXS songs, I didn't realize how political it was until just recently. Finding that out was pretty interesting. And also that Bob Dylan story I thought was kind of funny too.
Yes, and there's also a story in there. Do you know the backstory about Rolf Harris? Did you do your research into him?
Rolf Harris? I've heard his name, but no, not really.
Yeah, he's one of the early interviews in the book. He was a quite iconic entertainer, wrote some very interesting, quite landmark Australian songs. They weren't rock songs. They weren't even really pop songs. They were kind of a combination of folk and novelty. But he was also a painter, an artist, and an entertainer. He entertained children and adults, and he moved to the UK and was a huge star there. But in the very early times of Me Too, mm-hmm. he was accused and found guilty of some pretty awful crimes and went to prison. And just the week that the book was coming out again back in the beginning of June, late May, news came out that he had finally died. He was very, very old. And I decided to keep the chapter in there for the same reason, that it's historical, that the songs exist. You can take all his awards away, you can strip him of all his honours, but you can't take the songs in the same way that people still played Michael Jackson everywhere. And nobody's given me a hard time about keeping the Rolf Harris chapter in Australia or the UK. But all to say that Andrew Farriss tells a funny story mm-hmm. about it, because they were all Rolf Harris fans. back in the 70s and 80s, and I think he said that he met Rolf on a plane and told him that he really wanted to call his kid Roll, so it would be Roll Farris. And obviously decades later we now know that Rolf wasn't quite the nice guy that he presented himself as, but I had a good time interviewing him. He was charming. So that's one backstory. Americans tend not to know who Rolf Harris is, but Australians and Brits certainly do.
I'll look him up. He sounds interesting.
Yeah, have a listen to Time. Well, he wrote a song called Tie Me Kangaroo Down Sport, and another one called Jake the Peg. So yeah, he was an entertainer.
Going back to George Young and Harry Vanda, I noticed you guys didn't talk about AC/DC. Was that by design? You just wanted to focus on them?
Well, they didn't write songs for AC/DC, and it was specifically about their songs with the easy beats, and their songs that they then wrote. It wasn't about their producing unless it was producing the songs they'd written. They wrote for John Paul Young, who was and still is a massive star in Australia and very well known around the world, and best known in America for Love Is in the Air.
Oh, yeah.
Which was a Vanda and Young song, and they wrote for so many other Australian acts through the Albert Productions house. So, no, there was no relevance. I asked several times to interview Angus and Malcolm Young. Yeah. Not because I'm an AC/DC fan, because I'm not, but because well, it's just not my thing. Stacey wanted to talk. When Stacey interviewed me, she's a big fan. She wanted to talk about AC/DC and conspiracy theories and all of that, about who wrote what. But no, but I wasn't a fan of several of the songwriters I interviewed. I wanted to interview them because in terms of music export, they are probably Australia's most commercially successful, unless you do count the Bee Gees, as Australian, because AC/DC have just sold so many albums and performed to such huge audiences. However, the same people in Australia that looked after Vanda and Young also looked after Angus and Malcolm, but wouldn't let me have AC/DC. Yeah. And I tried to go around those people. I went straight to their New York-based management, and they reverted it back to the Australian people, who said, well, we already told you no. So, and the sad thing about that was that I knew people in the industry that were very close to Angus and Malcolm, and who said to me, this is a real shame because Malcolm would probably love to do this, to be taken seriously as a songwriter. In the same way that Chrissy Amphlett from Divinals was really grateful to be taken seriously, because Divinals were known as a hardcore rock group, and she was a rock chick, and she was very pleased to be considered as a songwriter for my book, and kept in touch with me for some time afterwards. Yeah. As did Nick Cave, and as did several of them, because they recognised what I was doing was really important work in acknowledging these people. AC/DC, I didn't happen. Yeah, I would have preferred Barry Gibb. If you'd said to me you have to choose between AC/DC and Bee Gees, Barry Gibb, I would have chosen Barry.
Yeah, I love AC/DC. My dad played the vinyl records. I dressed like Angus around the house listening to them. I
bet you still do, Tommy. You're there in your school uniform, aren't you? Your little cap.
I did for Halloween about 12 years ago, I want to say.
Oh, my gosh.
I'm a big AC/DC fan. The Colin Hay interview. Oh, my God. When my dad... He loves the song "Who Can It Be Now," and he always felt that it was like a cocaine paranoia anthem, and that's pretty close to what it is. He explains, he lived next door to drug dealers. I was laughing when I read that.
Oh, the people knocking on the door! I know. Yeah. I know. Let me tell you something. I saw back in June here in LA, I went to see Ringo Starr and his all-star band. And of the whole lineup, the one that got the greatest response and the one who still sounds the best was Colin Hay.
Yeah.
And it was amazing for an Australian sitting at the Greek Theatre to see all these people who were there for Ringo singing Colin's songs back at him. It was wonderful. That's I can only imagine what it's like for him getting up on stage with all these legends like Steve Lukather and Edgar Winter and whatever, and there he is singing Who Can It Be There and Who Can It Be Now and Down Under and hearing American audiences sing it back to him. That's very cool.
Yeah, now I noticed you mentioned Overkill, but you didn't mention It's a Mistake, which is a anti-war song. It's very compelling and haunting. I was curious, did you just not have interest in that song?
Did I not ask him about It's a Mistake?
I didn't see It's a Mistake mentioned in there at all, and I was looking for if there was any specific backstory to it.
You're asking me about an interview I did 20 years ago?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, or 19 years ago, because I think I saw him in 2004. Well, now you've got me curious. So I am, as we talk, my book has a song index, so that if you want to find out about a particular song, you can look it up. And you're right, it's not in there. So I don't know. Yeah. I don't remember if I asked him about it and his response was, I don't remember, or whether I just didn't get around to asking him about that one.
Yeah, it's a very haunting song, and it sounds like a typical Men at Work song, but you can feel the dark undercurrent vibe of it. It's not Down Under or Who Can It Be Now. It's just it's a song with a purpose.
Yeah, but Down Under was pure irony and satire.
Yeah.
I mean, Colin's a Scot. He's Scottish. You want to talk about Scottish songwriters?
Yeah.
And he's got his dark side, and he's very ironic and funny, but yeah, I'm sorry I didn't ask him about that. Now that you're mentioning it, or I'd have to go back to my original transcript. So now you've got me curious. Yeah,
sorry, it's just I was just curious. Being a huge fan of Men at Work, I was like, how come that song's not mentioned?
I'll have to check that one.
At least you mentioned Be Good Johnny also. I love that song as well. I'm also a huge Icehouse fan. I think they're such an underrated band, and I liked reading that Iva Davies was influenced by Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, which is completely far removed from the Icehouse music. And that anecdote about Great Southern Land was amazing, about going on tour and being homesick. It's such a hypnotic, transcending song.
Well, that song is one song of several that is like an unofficial national anthem in Australia. And what I found, I've interviewed Iva twice for not only for my book but for the National Film and Sound Archive of Australia for their oral history program. And his detail in remembering how he wrote songs and how a particular, because he writes in quite an unconventional way. There's one story about, the vacuum cleaner and how that inspired a groove and a note that he built around. And he was very interestingly specific about those sorts of stories. I liked the story about writing with John Oates and how it was sort of an airport encounter that, John then flew all the way to Australia to do this. And it was a hit, Electric Blue. I think you're right. Iva is still very productive in Australia and very highly regarded. And just a really nice man. Really nice guy.
He's got that energy when I see him in interviews. He's one of those guys that has that aura of like, I'm happy to be here and I'm happy to help.
Yeah, and he's also incredibly articulate and smart. Some songwriters, they're not necessarily as articulate about the process as their songs are. And so that's why, one in particular, it was like squeezing blood out of a stone. It still makes for a good interview, but, I wanted to strangle this particular guy I'm thinking of. And then others, most of them are pretty articulate. And they're all storytellers one way or another. Some are just a little more shy about talking about themselves, such as John Farrar.
Yeah. I, just like him, I prefer Crazy over Electric Blue. I think Electric Blue is an okay song, but like Crazy and My Obsession are my favorite songs from Man of Colors.
Okay, well, Man of Colors is a great album.
Yeah.
Great album.
It was their biggest album in the States, too. I like Neil Finn's interview. Something you said in there made me laugh out loud. He was talking about where he got the inspiration for A World Where You Live, based on being woken up by his neighbors having sex. And you said, you have a lot of these experiences with people having sex near you.
I remember that, yeah.
I wish I could have seen the look on his face.
He was, it's interesting thinking about Neil then, who would, he was fine, he took it in his stride. I don't remember if he laughed or just smiled a little, but if you think about Neil's trajectory since then, I mean, he ended, he'd already ended Crowded House, and then he brought it back, and then he toured with Fleetwood Mac, and then he brought Crowded House back again, and constantly, and then his son has grown up and become a band member with him, and that the DNA in that family, the Finn. I mean, I actually enjoyed my interview with his older brother Tim more. Because Tim, to me, it's my favourite interview. He's the absolute epitome of the articulate, poetic songwriter speaking. And everything he said to me, I was like, oh, man, I hope the tape recorder's working because this is so quotable. Split Enz were a really pivotal group in New Zealand and Australia. They were not the first art rock group, but they were the ones who were the most noticeable, who, really broke through in the mid-70s as a pop group.
I compare Split Enz to Squeeze. Squeeze is British, but they're pretty similar in that they're both influenced by like 60s guitar pop, and they brought the new wave, sounds of the 80s in it.
Yeah, that's an interesting comparison. I mean, the only song there were two songs from Squeeze, and we had to call them UK Squeeze in Australia because there was already an Australian pop group called Squeeze. Yeah. I mean, Cool for Cats is one of the best songs from that era. But Split Enz, I mean, Tim is just an extraordinary songwriter, and the True Colours album from 1980 was such a breakthrough. It was 79, 80. There's a song called I Hope I Never. And, I always presumed it was about a broken heart over a relationship with a woman, but it was actually about his bandmate.
Wow.
And he talks about that in the interview, that, when bandmates break up, when one leaves the band or they argue and they break up, that's a relationship, that's a brother, that's a marriage, whatever. And it really affected Tim. So I was fascinated to learn the background of songs like that. The first song on that album, Shark Attack, it's one of my favourite opening. It reminded me, very different, but I always think of a song that opens an album, and I just thought Shark Attack was so fascinating, but also Queen on a Night at the Opera and Death on Two Legs, and songs like that open albums, that's enough, How brilliant is that?
I personally prefer Crowded House. Those first two albums are just extraordinary. The first one is kind of almost Squeeze-esque pop, and then the second one is a lot darker. Better Be Home Soon and Temptation. Those are wonderful songs.
Oh, Into Temptation's probably my favourite. Look, Neil is an extraordinary songwriter, and has been compared to Paul McCartney, and very much inspired by that whole Beatles thing, whereas Tim's inspiration was the Kinks.
Right.
But both British, New Zealanders inspired by Britpop. Yeah, I mean, these are the conversations that emerge from a book of conversations with songwriters, and I really appreciate that you've gone so deep.
I really love this stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you mentioned before John Farrar, who wrote "You're the One I Want," which became, Olivia's signature song in Greece, which turns 45 this year. Were you a big Olivia Newton-John fan? Did you try to get her?
Well, Olivia, although she wrote some songs, is not, and particularly, from Gaia on, from when she had breast cancer, and she wrote an album called Gaia, which I did interview her about at the time, and then later on, when she did the Live On project with Beth Nielsen Chapman and Amy Skye, and she was writing more. Back in and it's funny how Americans all call John Farrar. It's Farrar. But no, John was her songwriter right through until the 80s and even beyond, but particularly in the 70s. He produced the great Peter Allen song, I Honestly Love You, which is probably her signature song. But he wrote Have You Never Been Mellow, and yes, You're the One That I Want, and Hopelessly Devoted, and so many other songs, Magic from Xanadu and Sam, and yes, a huge Olivia fan, humongous, and devastated when she did pass last year, although I knew it was coming for some time. And she had been so ill, particularly in the last couple of years, and in so much pain. And it's awful to think of someone like Olivia in that kind of pain. Huge fan, and that was just such a massive loss for the world and particularly for Australia. Yeah, I mean, Have You Never Been Mellow was one of my favourite songs in the 70s. Her songs I definitely was, singing along to and lip syncing to, and no idea that I would get to know John Farrar and interview him twice, and become friends with him. To this day, I'm friends with him, and I just think he's incredible. He's a genius.
Yeah.
In without being quite, he didn't have a sandpit, but very much in that Brian Wilson kind of almost tortured genius way, where he's always trying to better himself. And that's why I said to him, look, you wrote You're the One That I Want, period. You don't have to do anything else. But of course, for an artist, it's never enough to have written a huge hit. And, almost not a day goes by if you listen to Classic Hits Radio when you won't hear You're the One That I Want. It evokes not just the film, but a whole era for a whole generation of people. And wow, to have done that, wow. It's incredible.
He's fantastic. Did you try getting like Jimmy Barnes or Helen Reddy or members of the church or anything?
Look, the church, Steve Kilbey probably should have, didn't. I think he would have been on my earlier list because there was a much bigger list. Helen,
she was complicated.
No. I would have to go back because my original hit list was more than 100. And I'm not sure if she may well have been on it, actually. And who was the other one you mentioned just
Jimmy
now?
Barnes.
Jimmy, no. Yeah, Nat. Don Walker was the interesting one from Cold Chisel. Jimmy, as a solo artist, he didn't write all the songs himself. His band, Cold Chisel, who never really broke through in a proper way here in America, but should have.
I never heard that band.
Well, if you do yourself a favor and go and listen to Cold Chisel albums,
Okay.
Particularly, well, all of them. Khe Sanh, which is about Vietnam veterans returning home, is from their first album, and that was their breakthrough hit, and it was banned originally in Australia. That is quite kind of up there as an Australian classic, along with Friday on My Mind, and Beds Are Burning from Midnight Oil. The Breakfast at Sweethearts album, quite apart from having one of the most beautiful album covers ever, is just full of incredible songs. And then East and Circus Animals and 20th Century. I mean, they are really one of the most important bands in Australian music history. And Don Walker, their songwriter, he's the one I interviewed. He is up there in my top 4 interviews. If someone asks me your favorite interviews in the book, he's up there in those top 4.
Nice.
Without a doubt.
I mean, I like Working Class Man. It kind of reminds me of Bob Seger with that piano and just the way he sings it, very anthemic. I like that song. And the one he did with NXS, Good Times, for the Lost Boys soundtrack. I mean, that stuff is good for Jimmy Barnes, I think. Now, you hosted a radio show in the 90s called Debbie Does Breakfast, which is
I did.
A brilliant name. Only a dirty-minded perv like me knows what that's a play on. Debbie Does Dallas.
Well, actually, I did it because of the Debbie Does Dallas. And the thing is, it's even more funny because I did do Dallas. All through the 80s, I was a mad fan of Dallas, the TV show, to the point where my 21st birthday party in 1983 was a Dallas-themed party, and I made everyone come dressed up as though they were in the TV show. And in fact, Jock Ewing, JR's father, had just been in a massive plane accident. So one of my friends came all bandaged and on crutches. Oh. He said, well, I watched an episode and there was a plane accident. So I've come as the victim of the plane accident. It was very funny. But yes, I did Dallas in that regard. And the first time I went to the city of Dallas, I did the tour of South Fork, and I was like a kid at Disneyland. I was so excited. So the radio show was called Debbie Does Breakfast, specifically to refer to that. And I have seen a couple of those Debbie Does Dallas films, I'll be honest.
I have too.
Because why not? Well, yeah, of course you have. You're a guy. But I did the show for 6 years in the 90s and then reprised it, depending on what your language is, for a 6-month period in 2008-9. And I was the favorite thing I've ever done, that radio show. I loved it.
Yeah, like, how come you didn't do it longer, and would you start a podcast now?
I need to, don't I?
Yeah.
I get the feeling that there are so many podcasts out there that how would I even, get an audience? But I'd love to, and I'd love to do a podcast where I do some interviews, but I don't just do interviews. But then you have to get permissions or license fees to play songs, and and I just, my thing is playing music I love and talking about it. But yeah, I should do a podcast. What would I call it? Debbie Does Podcast?
I don't know. Debbie Upper instead of Debbie Downer. I don't know.
Oh my God! Now I can be a real Debbie Downer.
I don't know, but you speak very well, and you're passionate about what you write about. I mean, I think doing a podcast would be good for you.
It would be fun. Yeah, no, a lot of people have suggested it, and every now and then I talk to somebody about doing a double act kind of podcast. It just hasn't happened.
What's your connection to the legendary Henry Diltz?
He's my best friend. Mm-hmm. I'll tell you, in his circle, there are so many people that consider Henry their best friend, Yeah.
He
just turned 85, and I'm going to his birthday party this weekend. I met him on that landmark watershed visit to LA I referred to in 1997 when I also picked up Paul Zollo's book. I wanted to interview him, so I did that, but mainly we just became fast friends. Next thing I knew, I was backstage at a Crosby, Stills, Nash concert, meeting the guys and getting IDs for my radio show. Hey, this is Graham Nash, and you're listening to my favourite show, and that kind of thing. And through Henry, I got to meet a lot of people just on that trip. And then I came and spent a year in LA the following year, and I did some PR work with him, and then that led to more. So whether I was in Australia or here, I was working on projects with him. I'm working on a project with him at the moment that I'm not going to talk about yet. Yeah. You know, for an 85-year-old, he's got a lot going on. Yeah. He is a legend. He's such a legend, and it was such a privilege to have him photograph Colin Hay and John Farrar for my book. They're wonderful. They were wonderful photo shoots. Yeah.
That man is the ultimate, rock photographer and legend, and I'm so happy that he's still with us and he's still active and everything. I mean, he is just astoundingly brilliant, I think.
Have you ever interviewed him?
I've reached out. I think that the message went to a spam folder, but no, I haven't actually reached out. I haven't actually made the connection.
Oh, well, I think I know someone that might be able to help.
Oh, wonderful. Wonderful. I forgot to mention before, your dad's tribute you do at the beginning of the book brought a tear to my eye. I thought it was really
sweet. No one has ever mentioned that. So, Tommy, you win a gold star just for noticing that. Oh. Yeah, you know what he sang to me? The first songs he sang to me? Mm-hmm. Do you know that old song, A, You're Adorable?
Oh, yeah.
A, you're adorable, B, you're so beautiful,
yeah.
C, you're the cutie of my charms. He'd sing that to me at bedtime, and Daisy, Daisy, give me an answer, do. I'm half crazy, all for the love of you, which I think was an English folk song. Yeah, he sang me to sleep at night, and he had just died before the book came out.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, well, we lose our parents, sadly. I lost my mother a few years after that. So, you know what I remember? My mother and I were, intensely close and butted heads constantly, like a lot of Jewish mothers and daughters do. Yeah. And she supported me and encouraged me in writing the book, but, it drove her mad, the intensity, because I was living with her for a while as the book came to a close. And we were at loggerheads. And then when I got the first print copy of the book, I gave her one. And she went off and looked at it, and she walked back into the room where I was just sitting watching TV, and she had tears in her eyes. And she said, I had no idea. I had no idea it was going to be as big as this. And I guess the dedication to Dad had also moved her. So my parents, they were incredibly encouraging of my love for music. They let me go to concerts on my own from the age of 14. Yeah. I would get the train to a concert and my dad would come pick me up. And I started going to these concerts on my own at that point. Like Bay City Rollers, Queen, I went to with friends, but it wasn't long before I was just saying to my parents, I'd like to go and see a Little River Band. And they'd go, buy yourself a ticket and Dad will go and pick you up. And that was it. I was very lucky.
I still got my parents, knock wood. So do you have anything upcoming? Are you going to write another book?
Well, I've been working for, 3 years now on a book about, I don't know if you read the chapter on a guy called Garth Porter. His band in the 70s was Sherbet, and they had one big overseas international hit in 1976 called How's That? But they were the biggest pop group in Australia in the 70s. So I started working on a book about Sherbet, and I did all through that first period of COVID when everyone back in Australia was in lockdown. I did hundreds of hours of interviews with people, and then I got diverted, and it sort of not quite been on the back burner. It's kind of been on the simmer. And that and a project I'm doing with Henry are my two writing projects that I, plan to finish. And then I've got all these other books I want to write. I did a road trip around America on my own 2 years ago for 5 months.
Nice.
I drove 15,000 miles, and I want to write about that, not as just a travel book, but a woman on her own driving. And I've long been researching a book about my mother's life. That's a whole other story. She was a Holocaust survivor and war refugee from Europe who was raised in Philadelphia and then ended up in Australia, and it's quite an epic story. So I'm a writer, but we all have things we have to do to make money, pay the rent, so I do PR work and communications, and I'm a writer for hire. But the books, I've got all these books I want to write before I die. So, and the podcast I need to do, right?
Yeah. Do the podcast, I'll listen to it. I'll even, I'll even share episodes,
Oh, thank you. I'll figure it out. Hey.
Absolutely. Real quick, we got to play my secret silly game. This is a series of silly slumber party questions. No win or lose. It's just pure fun. And how the game works is I ask you the question, you answer it, and then you ask me that exact same question and I answer it. And feel free to comment on answers because they might be funny.
Okay.
Debbie, are you ticklish?
I am. Are you ticklish?
Oh, yes. If you tickled me without warning, I might hit you in the groin.
Oh, well, I'm not letting you hit me in my groin.
Is your belly button an innie or an outie?
Oh, my God. You know what? I can't even talk about belly buttons. I have got such a phobia. My friends know. When I was a kid, my friends would tease me and they'd play with their own belly buttons just to hurt me. Yeah. I can't look at a belly button. I hate belly buttons. It's a very deep innie, and I think that's probably the problem. What about you? Is your belly button an innie or an outie?
I also have a deep innie. Yes, and it's my favorite part of the body.
Oh no, I can't even imagine it. Stop it. I don't want to know.
Don't worry. I'll respect your boundaries. What color are your toenails painted?
Oh, French tip.
Oh, I love it.
Tommy, what color are your toenails painted?
Right now they're not painted, but last time they were purple lavender. I like to go elaborate.
Oh, I expect a photo next time.
Oh, I've got plenty of pictures of my toenails painted.
Fabulous.
What would you say is your best personality trait?
Honesty.
Yeah, I love honesty. It's my favorite trait in the world.
So that's the answer to the question if I ask you, right?
Well, it's that, yes, I'm very honest, but I also have empathy and no filter because I'm a Gemini.
Yeah, I'm a Leo. I don't think we have filters really either.
No. I know a lot of Leos that have raunchy mouths, I'll tell you. If you could have anything named after you, what would it be?
Oh, Debbie Kruger, an album, an amazing record. If Linda Ronstadt could sing again, she would record an album and call it For Debbie Kruger.
Nice.
If you could have anything named after you, what would it be?
A vibrator.
Oh, my God. Watching Debbie Does Dallas, right?
Exactly. I would call it the Tommy Chatsy.
Oh, you had that ready to go. Yeah. Okay. Oh, yeah.
It's a newer question. And then my favorite question, is there a stinky smell that just makes you gag?
Rotten egg.
That is terrible.
Just that rotten egg gas. What about you?
Either farts or feet.
Farts can sometimes be sweet.
I've heard some people say that, but I just don't see it.
I've got a question for you. What are you doing tonight? And I'm not asking you out.
What am I doing tonight? I'm probably going to just chill, listen to some podcasts that I like to listen to during the week, and that's about it.
You have to ask me now.
What are you doing tonight?
I'm going to the Grammy Museum here in LA to see Brandi Carlile and Brandi Clark talk about Brandi Clark's new album.
Nice.
And I just spent the weekend in Colorado seeing Brandy Carlisle 2 nights in a row at Red Rocks. And that is why I love living in LA. Because, sure, I went to Denver, but the music, the culture, it's like songwriters are revered here, and organizations like the Recording Academy and the Grammy Museum, are constantly doing exciting things, and that the whole Brandy thing tonight sold out in a heartbeat, and I'm a Grammy Museum member. So, yep, as soon as I get off from you, I'm getting ready, and I'm hitting that nasty 10 freeway downtown.
Well, I know LA traffic, so I'm going to let you go now. Debbie, thank you so much for coming on today. I'm so glad that Stacy put you on her podcast and that we connected.
Oh, thank you.
You are just so wonderful, and I love what you're doing. Keep on doing what you do, and have a blast tonight.
Thanks, Tommy. So cool to talk to you. Hope we can do it again sometime.
I hope so. Be safe.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Well, there you have it. Debbie Kruger. Ain't she a sweetheart? Oh, what a great lady, huh? I love ladies from down under, especially Jewish ladies from down under. Wow, Debbie does breakfast, Debbie does Dallas. I love that connection. I love her honesty. Well, until next time, this is Tommy Throwback Kovac saying, there's no shame in living in the past, because the present sucks. Later, dudes. I come from a land down under, where women glow and men plunder. Can't you hear the thunder? Better run, better take cover.